about to get started. Thanks for joining us. Day 2 of the VLSC 4 Year Anniversary weekend. We're going to start things off with the Atlanta Synthesizer Club and VLSC event series that I host called Synth Sunday. And today our special guest is Richard Devine. We're going to kick things off with an interview section and then open up Q&A to the chat. Thanks for joining us live on Twitch. And we'll be taking questions in the Twitch chat. And so, without further ado, let's get started. Hey, Richard, how's it going?
Hello?
Yep.
You guys can hear me pretty well?
Yep, sounds good to me.
Cool.
Hopefully, the folks in Twitch, I'm sure, will let us know. So, actually, let me pull it up on my phone so I can keep up with the chat while we're going. So anyway, welcome to Synth Sunday. For those of you who don't know me, I am Flohr, and Richard shouldn't need any introduction, but let's assume that there are some folks watching either who stumbled into this room in the chat or who are checking out this video when we post the archive on YouTube, and maybe they haven't heard of you or they're new to electronic music and music technology and synths. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and the elevator pitch.
Sure. Yeah, I guess summing up, I'm an electronic artist, sound designer, or whatever you want to call it, tinker of sound. Been working in the audio industry for probably 27 years, 26 years now. And yeah, started when I was, 16, 17 in high school as a DJ, and eventually got into electronic music production, and then had a crazy career that's been all over the place, working with record labels, touring, living that life, to eventually kind of accidentally getting into sound design in 1999 with Native Instruments, and then with them started working with other companies, and eventually got working into film, video games, TV, and then that eventually led into lots of other things, working with different agencies around the world, sound design for iOS apps to operating systems for computers to a handful of different devices like Barnes & Noble Nook tablets to the iPad to Google's stuff. I've done so many things, I've actually forgotten how much stuff I've done. People will remind me and I'll be like, oh yeah, I did that. And I was like, oh, that was like ages ago. But yeah, I do all kinds of stuff. Basically, just sum it up short. I work with sound and, implementing sound into different environments outside of music composition, whether that's virtual reality, electric cars, or yeah, all kinds of stuff. It goes into all different places. Just having fun with it.
Well, that's awesome. It's quite a resume. I have to say I'm amused that you had worked on the Nook, because I was a one-time Barnes & Noble employee. So
you were? Nice.
It was around the time when they first rolled that out to try to compete with the other e-readers. So interesting.
Yeah.
So one of the things that this is a relatively new series for folks who haven't tuned in for Synth Sunday yet, we've had Walker Farrell from Make Noise come on. We had Houston Singletary from Ableton, a sound designer from many different companies, but specifically
Houston's
came on
great.
and talked to Ableton. And today we're speaking with Richard Devine. And my general kind of structure, it's pretty loose, but I like to sort of do a kind of past, present, future thing through the course. So you gave your your personal history kind of recap. And I want to ask some more questions maybe about some things in the past to start, and then we can kind of talk about what you're doing now. And then at the end,
Sure.
if you want to kind of say even the hyper current, like what's on the horizon or what you're excited about. And again, that doesn't even have to be, your own work or whatever. It could be about gear or software or other things that are exciting that are on the horizon. So I'm putting that out there now to say where we're going. And in the middle, we'll have some of the Q&A with the live chat. So
Sure.
Thanks, folks, for tuning in. And if you do have a question that comes to your mind, this is to the chat. Anybody in the chat, if you think of something, you can ask it now or hold it for later. I will try to go back and look and see if we missed any questions, but we're going to probably try to hold those at least for a little while. So thanks for everyone for watching live. So yeah, I was just curious a bit about, one thing that kind of struck me is like, the music you make, specifically in terms of your own musical output, it's, broadly we could say experimental music or electronic music that's not like the mainstream kind of pop approach, right? But I know that you have an influence and a background in dance music and in other things, and so I was sort of curious about, and I had mentioned it maybe when I messaged you about sort of IDM and the idea of it and how you feel, because I know some people don't like the term. There's been a lot of kind of back and forth on that, and then there's been a bit of a revival of interest in it. And I'm always just curious to get someone's perspective on how did they relate, on the one hand, as like an experimental artist or an avant-garde artist or whatever you want to call it, and on the other hand, someone that's into dance music culture and acid and rave and that kind of stuff. And where did you, as a young person, as a DJ, how did you relate to those kinds of concepts? And where does the IDM fit into that?
Well, that's interesting. I guess when I first started making music, it was in high school, and it kind of all just happened organically. I guess if you go all the way back to the beginning, I started taking piano lessons. I took classical training for about 8-9 years that my mom forced me and my brother to do. We weren't really too into the idea. When you're like 8-9 years old, it's like the last thing you want to do is play piano. Me and my brother were like, oh, we want to ride BMX bikes and skateboard and catch poisonous snakes in the creek. Piano lessons is lame. We don't want to do that, And so I didn't really appreciate it at the time. It was something that I guess like it wasn't until I was like 12 or 13 till I really started to take more interest in music. And when I was through skateboarding, I got more interested in music through the culture of skateboarding, which was listening to a lot of music that came around that, which at that time, I want to say we're going back to about like 89, 90, even before that, like late 80s. I was into a lot of like early, hip hop. I love the sound of like Public Enemy, EPMD, Eric B, Rakim, that sort of stuff was really big. Especially in the skateboarding scene, you were either listening to early hip hop or thrash metal or DIY punk music, which was also really big. I was a huge Minor Threat fan, Discord Records fan, loved all that stuff. And, 7 Seconds, bands like that were really influential. When we would do skate videos and stuff, it would either be one of the two. You would either get thrash metal or you'd get hip hop or something, and when we make our videos back in the day, those were all the kind of music that we love. And from that, I kind of accidentally discovered industrial music when it started emerging and getting more popular. I want to say in like mid to late 90s, at least for me, is when I started to get into it. And I found that to be almost like a perfect melding of like the synthetic sounds and sampled sounds of hip hop with this like newer form of like aggressive left field punk style of music making. So I was really drawn to that. So I would say like the earliest groups that really influenced me were like Coil, SPK, and Skinny Puppy, and a lot of the Canadian industrial music that was pretty big at the time, stuff coming out of Europe as well, Frontline Assembly, Front 242, that sort of stuff. And I love the mechanical machinery aspect to it, how it was almost, it didn't sound very human. It was very cold and clinical. I don't know what it was about that, but it really kind of struck a chord with me. And I think one of the groups that stood out was Meat Beat Manifesto. I was a huge Jack Dangers fan. I still am to this day. Love his work. And I remember hearing the Mindstream Remixes EP that he released that had a remix by DHS, and then there was a remix by Aphex Twin. And I didn't know who Aphex Twin was at the time, and I was completely blown away by his remix that I just sort of discovered by accident by buying a 12-inch, and I was like, I need to find out more about who this person is. And I remember just kind of like, researching more and more, and I discovered that Richard James was running a record label with his friend Grant in Cornwall called Reflex Records, and I started buying all of their records back in the day. I would have ordered, this was back when Tower Records was around, and for those of you that remember, there was a buyer there that I was ordering a lot of the stuff from that was helping me get a lot of these imports because they were all coming from the UK, so I was able to get just about every single early Reflex release. And then around about that same time, we're talking like maybe 1988, 97, 96, during that time, I discovered Warp Records. Richard had signed a deal with RNS, and then he did another EP with Warp, the On remixes. And then I found out it was just kind of like this book unraveling with more chapters, finding out about more artists and more music and this sort of style that Richard was writing, because I was really intrigued by. And I didn't even know what to call it. They weren't even calling it IDM music back then. It was just a few emerging artists coming from Sheffield and, various parts of England that were making this sort of newer type of sound that was kind of fusing elements of like Kraftwerk and early, like Brian Eno meets Mantronics. It's just all these different strange influences that were sort of cultivating this new sound that was really exciting to me at the time. It was very interesting and new, and it was kind of like pushing the boundaries. And I think one of the first compilations that came out that Warp Records released was the Artificial Intelligence comp, which I think is where a lot of the IDM terminology name they called it intelligent dance music. I know everyone at the time thought it was a really silly term, and I know still a lot of musicians, friends and peers of mine that make music similar in that similar vein, also thought it was a pretty silly term. But originally it was meant, and I know Steve Beckett at Warp, and Steve had and that album intentionally was made for, it was like sort of like after the rave, after you guys have been partying all night, you put on the Artificial Intelligence compilation. It's like music for your brain, music to listen to in your living room after a full night of raving, which was their sort of approach at the time, which I thought was like such a neat concept. It was more like what they called brain dance music. And and the compilation did extremely well. I remember when it initially came out, it had some other artists that were fellow friends of mine, like Robin Shaw, Autechre, and Joachim Pop and Richie Houghton, and it was an excellent compilation. Even to this day, I still feel it stands the test of time. But I think a lot of people just sort of kind of cling that term as intelligent. It's like, oh, it's music for intelligent people, but it was really, like I said, I think that kind of really throws people off. But yeah, a lot of those tracks, when that series came out, was a series of albums that came out, I want to say those were a compilation of stuff. It was from 92 to 1994. And it was, like I said, it was a lot of great stuff, and they continued to do that. And I didn't know at the time, it was funny, because I was starting to get into all this stuff. I didn't know in 2001 that Warp would actually be the label that would release my first full-length album. So it was kind of crazy to have this stuff kind of come full circle, because I'd been listening to, like I said, Aphex, Black Dog, B12, I'm trying to think who else, Autechre. I mean, there's just so many great artists on the label, and I love the aesthetic. I love the direction that they were going in. I love the idea, just the whole idea of what they were trying to go for, and it was very revolutionary to me at the time, and that really stuck with me. And I knew at that point, I was like, this is the kind of music I want to make. It speaks the most to me, I guess, in a way, and I've just sort of stayed with it all these years. And you could probably say that the heyday, the peak of that, was probably late 90s, early 2000s, when it was at its peak. And, we had a good 13, 14 years when it was running. And for those of you who may not know, I was also running helping out 2 other friends of mine who run a record label called Schematic Records that we also ran. It's still operating. My friend Ram is still running it. Although I don't think they're doing that many physical releases. I think it's mostly digital, but yeah, back in, late 90s or early 2000s, we were really, really one of the, I'd say, premier experimental US-based IDM electronic labels that was doing we were doing pretty well back then before the iPod came and mass digital distribution of music really changed things after 2001, 2002. I remember that being a big shift, talking about Tower Records, when Tower Records and a lot of the major retail music stores started going out of business, and that also funneled down to the distribution companies that would distribute the music. So as a record label that we were running, we saw our distribution chain go from 12 to 13, now down to 3, down to 2, down to 1. It's just, the model that we were trying to use to sell records just wasn't working anymore, because people were looking to just, stream stuff or keep stuff on their iPhones or iPods. They wanted to have 10,000 songs in their pocket. And who wouldn't? I was one of those people too. I was looking for more convenience, because I'm a big music nerd. So obviously I'd love to have every one of my favorite albums at the, touch of one, the touch screen in my pocket. So yeah, it was just kind of the way things went. But yeah, we learned a lot, and it was a great time. I had a wonderful time working with all those. I've worked with other labels, Asphodel, Sublight Records, Planet Mu. I'm trying to think. Ghostly International. There's been so many. I did some stuff. We did some stuff with Ninja Tune Records. There's been so many compilations and remixes and releases over the years, and it's been great. It's like I said, I wouldn't trade any of it for the world. Like I had made such great relationships with all of these people, and still friends with all of these people at these labels even to this day. And but yeah, that kind of gives you a little backtrack of where I came from in sort of like the musical the music domain.
Well, that's great, and I have a next question I want to go to, but you said a lot there, and there's a couple things I want to circle back to. First of all, I have to say shout out DC Hardcore, because I'm from DC, and Discord Records,
nice.
And that's like what I came up on. And in many ways, like the whole Discord thing, it was a way into the more, whatever you want to call it, IDM or experimental electronic, because going from being a Minor Threat kid to understanding Fugazi and what they were doing, and in a sense post-punk, and that kind of was a way of thinking about, okay, so there's hip-hop and there's dance music, and then there's this other stuff that's like a hybrid that's bringing in this ambient and this other types of genres coming in, like you were talking about. And I appreciate what you said, because we don't like the term IDM. It can be misunderstood, right, in a way of like, it can sound pejorative towards, what the bad rap it gets is that it's, as in it implies other music, dance music is dumb, like,
Yeah.
But that's, to me, in a sense, it's not the point. It's what you were talking about. Is that it's thoughtful, artful music that is meant for head music, that is a home listening or another type of experience, and it doesn't have to be down, because all those artists, yourself included, love dance music, and it's an influence. It's present in the music, so it's not meant to be like an identity, putting them down, like IDM's up here, and that's not the point. But I really appreciated all you said about it. A lot of insight, and what the next question I wanted to get to, the segue, was talking about regional experience, because you mentioned this industrial music coming from Canada, and then this UK sound, that this early music that you're discovering before it's even called IDM, that's coming out of the UK late 80s, early 90s electronic music, which in many ways is them borrowing from American, they're taking from Chicago, they're taking from Detroit, they're taking from New York.
Absolutely.
And you're here in the South, and you're listening to this music, and then you started to mention some American labels versus the UK labels. So I wanted to ask you about, what was it like being in Georgia back then, and being an American, being in the South. learning about this stuff, was there a scene that you felt connected to, or was it like more connections with people like abroad, like, and also what role did the internet play in these connections? I'm curious about that.
It's a good question, because the internet at that time was, how can we say, it wasn't what it was today, where you have access to pretty much any bit of information you want to get your hands on, these YouTube videos and, endless amounts of info on any subject that you want to search for. Back then, things were a little harder to get to, a little more mysterious. There was a bit more digging around that you had to do as far as getting information. And it's interesting you bring up, crews and things, because when I started to get into, I could say like probably around 89 to like 90, 91 is when I started to get into more like techno. When you mentioned techno music and stuff, like I also was listening to a lot of American electronic music at the time as well. Some of my favorite groups were coming out of Detroit, a lot of the early Detroit stuff, like Drexcia was a big one for me. Juan Atkins, Model 500. I loved all of Mike Banks' records. The Galaxy to Galaxy stuff he did is still, like, to me, some of the most untouchable, cool. Just, I don't even know what you call that. I remember getting his records and being like, yeah, it's electronic, but it's got some things that are like influences of jazz and like techno and electro, and like I just really couldn't put my finger on what you would even call that. And I just loved music that made me question what it even was, and I guess Mike was another really big influence on me. And then eventually I started discovering other artists in the Detroit music scene, and of course discovered Richie's music. The early Plastic Man stuff was just hugely influential. It's funny, I just talked with Richie a couple days ago. He sent me his Model 1 mixer that I've been testing out here. But yeah, we've gotten to be friends after all these years. Really cool guy. And yeah, so his early stuff was also a byproduct of the Detroit music scene too. He was also influenced by a lot of these people, and one of his main influences was Jeff Mills. And Jeff Mills, also huge influence. I loved and have many of his records on Access, and some of the artists that he had put out, like Rob Hood, and there's other artists like Claude Young. They're doing some very, very cool, interesting music, especially taking the techno sound and doing something a little more left field, a little more abstract. Like it's still designed for the dance floor, but it's, it's not exactly like your straight ahead typical techno stuff, which is what I really loved about those guys, and still do. I still love a lot of their work. And so that, that kind of laid like the foundation when you were talking about. And then, like scenes, like the scenes I was about, this is about when I was 17 in high school, going back, in high school. And there wasn't really any scenes. I didn't really have a lot of friends who were into this kind of music. So my friend Jason and I were the only two, one of my best friends, we were the only two people that were into like rave music, if you want to call it that. 'Cause we were going to raves, basically. This was during a time when Atlanta there was a bunch of raves, just a few scenes. A couple of my friends, Jonathan, I don't know, a lot of these guys, I don't even know if they're DJing anymore, but they were part of the early rave scene in early 90s. But they were bringing like a lot of it back then. The Atlanta scene was very influenced by the Florida break scene, DJ3, the whole Tampa thing, and Dave Christopher, Rabbit the Moon, who I'm also really good friends with. And nothing against that stuff. I think they make really great music and things. It wasn't really my kind of cup of tea. I was much more influenced by the sound of the Midwest. Stuff that Kurt and Patrick at Drop Bass Network were releasing, like early acid stuff, and artists like Woody McBride, and they were throwing these parties up in Wisconsin, Chicago, in Kentucky. We were actually going to raves out of state, driving up to the Midwest, going to Chicago, going to see a lot of these music festivals and raves in barns that were set up illegally on someone's property. I must have went to like 20 or 30 of these. And we used to all log into this site called V-Rave. I don't know if you guys know what V-Rave is, but it was a BBS-like forum. There was no graphics. It was basically just like this DOS text prompt stuff where your friends would log in And it was basically a way for us to all communicate with each other that liked the same kind of music. And it was also a great way, because it was completely secured, encrypted way of communicating back then. It was a great way to find about parties that were happening. So back then they would post on V-Rave, yay, we're throwing, there's a party happening in Columbus, Ohio this weekend. You know, it's going to be, you know, it's like, there would be like these early like drum and bass, moving shadow style party happening or something. And, or it would be some style like back then the raves would be like a couple of different rooms of music. You'd have like acid techno, or, you know, it was like this multi thing. It wasn't like some of these, you know, other parties that would just be kind of focused on one style of music. You know, it was much more multifaceted kind of styles and stuff. But yeah, it was really cool. It was sort of, it was super underground. Like, it was like, if you knew how to get in, you knew what you were looking for, you could kind of figure it out. And even getting to these parties was interesting. They would like leave markers on trees to drive out to these locations of like, you know, to get to these parties that where they'd set up some sound system illegally. And it was just super cool. It was like a whole different vibe back then. The way that things were brewing, you felt like you were part of this thing. But in Georgia, it was totally different. I felt it was also starting to cultivate and start to get bigger. But it was, like I said, it was much more influenced by the Florida scene. You were never getting the Detroit, Chicago influence. It was very rare that you would see, you know, Derek Carter or somebody like that come play at one of these early parties. I'm not saying he eventually did come down and play as the scene got more evolved and people started branching out, listening to more like house music and techno. You started to see a lot more of that music showing up down here in Georgia, but it took a while. It took about 3 or 4 years, and then things started to branch out from there. But it was an interesting time. Yeah, I remember coming into class, you know, as a 17-year-old and like being really excited in my art class, like, oh my God, I just saw this group 808 State. They blew my mind away. I saw them play live, and my friends were like, what's 808 State? And, you know, none of my peers knew what kind of music that was. But I was just really just like a sponge, just soaking all of this up at that time. And it was just a really fun, interesting period for electronic music. You know, there was a lot of stuff emerging, and like I felt like the energy at that time too was totally different than it is now. There was a lot of experimentation and a lot of pushing the envelope of what could be done, you know, stylistically, structurally in the music, even in the rhythms, like how they were experimenting, which, you know, kind of led me down even more the path of like sort of like that IDM brain dance sort of style of music. I felt like there was so much innovation happening at that time, and that there was this sort of overall really interesting vibe in the air that kind of just made, I don't know, you just could feel it, you know, you go to the parties and like just this overall, like, I miss that. I wish I could go back to that time. It was such a fun time, at least for me. But yeah, that's kind of, you know, tracing back to some certain key points, some certain things and how things were, you know, how we were going to parties and some of the scenes that we were involved with. But I would say mostly, like I said, the Midwest was where I made most of the connections with. And then eventually one of the first Midwest techno labels released one of my first albums, Drop Bass Network, actually eventually did release my 666 record that came out in 1994. Yeah, 94. But I did the tracks like 90, 92, 93. They were much older. But I'd come out that year, and I remember that record coming out and kind of was like the first time that was actually me getting put on the map, because they were an international label, so the record was selling all over the world, and it kind of got my name out there. No one knew who I was. It's like, who is this guy? Who's Richard Devine? That's a weird name. Is this some guy is this like a guy trying to pretend to be Aphex, or is this Aphex under a different moniker? Actually, people actually thought it was Aphex. Because the graphics on the record were all weird. I'd like scan my college biology, one of my biology books, like the inside of a brain. Like it was really funny. It was all black and white. I did the graphics at Kinko's on one of their old computers when they used to have like computers in there where you could work on Photoshop, Illustrator. It was really horrible. But yeah, it was an interesting, like I said, it was an interesting time period. growing up, you know, learning about electronic music, going to these raves and learning about the rave scene and seeing these amazing DJs and performers play on, you know, every other weekend for me was just such a treat. And I just felt like, oh, this is so cool, you know, that this is happening right now. And like I said, I also went to a lot of the Atlanta raves too. So it was cool to see. I was regionally traveling up and down the coast to these parties. It was just interesting how different the vibes were in different areas, you know. But for me, I'd say the Detroit, like the parties at Motor, that club was legendary. We saw so many like legendary shows and stuff there, and a lot of the parties that Kurt and Patrick threw in Chicago and in Wisconsin. Some of the, I mean, they were the first people to bring Daft Punk to play at the Even Further Festival, and they were like 16 years old or something at the time. And then and they also brought Aphex. Kurt brought the first Further party. They brought Richard James to play. It was the first time Aphex ever played in the US. Like they knew, like those guys really, really knew what was like interesting. No matter what, they just always had their ear on the next new cool thing. So it was like I said, it was a really exciting time to be into that stuff and be a part of that scene.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great hearing these stories, and it's interesting for me because I'm not from Georgia, and a lot of my friends and the crew in the VLSC crew that I'm in, but also members of the Synth Club. Some of them are locals, some of them are transplants like me. So I'm always interested to learn about the kind of history of the regional scene, and I think anybody who's into experimental electronic music, experimental music in general, avant-garde music, but has probably had that experience of getting really into something, and then when you're young, and then your peers, like, no one knows what the fuck you're talking about. Because I first got into Audacur when LP5 came out, and I was pretty young, and I brought that in to my peers because I was like, they were the cool kids. They liked alternative rock and whatever, and some industrial maybe. And I was like, they're like aliens. Like, this is something else. You guys will love this because you like weird things. And none of them understood. They were like, no. My friends were like, this isn't music. I don't like that. And I was like heartbroken. I was like, how could they not love it? It's so good. So, that, and then you find your community. You find your people. So for me, and it was a cool experience to then go from that memory to then being at Terminal West shortly after I moved to Atlanta. And they're basically sold out. I don't know if it was sold out, but it was packed house seeing Audacur, And
yeah.
so,
you were at that show, yeah.
There are people who love this music. There's a community, and so, it's cool to find that. I wanted to ask about, we can segue, we haven't really talked about gear, and, many people who know you and follow you, that maybe the first thing they think of is like synthesizers, and again, this is Synth Sunday, so, so as a segue to talk about it, for you, because you mentioned you had some musical training and you had a background to some extent, but was it that you got into this music as a fan and as someone going to the parties, and then you wanted to learn how to make it, or you wanted to? What was the kind of process to starting to be someone who is trying to buy synths or learn how to use them, and then also how did you find them? What was that like? Again, the kind of like regional question about where were you able to find equipment? Like, what was that like?
That's a good question too. Yeah, it's funny that gear. I guess gear comes up a lot because I post a lot of stuff, and that all actually really just kind of happened by accident. My first run-ins with gear, I guess, was in the early '90s, late '80s, early '90s, when my music store basically back then was the pawn shops. I was buying all my gear secondhand from pawn shops, and I actually still have a lot of that gear that I bought back in the day. Some of it I sold, a lot of it that I held on to. It just depended on what it was and how much I used it. But for me, back then, I was trying to learn about this stuff. And, like I said, going back to the old internet thing, the internet wasn't really a great place for a lot of that information. You really had to just find stuff, get your hands on it. There were some publications, there were some books. There were magazines back then too. And then just going to shows and being like, I love this group. I remember going to see Orbital play because they were really big. I was a really big Orbital fan back in the day. Now I know Paul and Phil personally now super nice guys, but back then I didn't know them. And I remember going to the shows and being like, what are they using? And looking on their keyboard rack, and I'm like, what are these two gray things they're pushing that are flat? And I was like, it says Alesis? Okay. I remember like taking notes, and I was like, so there must be some sort of thing that arranges things, because they keep pressing these things. And it was kind of like these mystery, like each part of the puzzle was like one piece that I had to put together and figure out how, you know, these things were, you know, being put together. It's like, oh, that was a sequencer. That was an MMT8. And they had two MMT8s, and those were giving them, that's how they're recording and unmuting tracks and building their songs live. And then I was looking at their keyboard racks and be like, what is that thing that says expander? And I was like, Oberheim, let me look that up. And yes, it was a lot of like trying to put the pieces together. Like, what are these things? Oh, these are synthesizers. Why are they using these synthesizers? And what are these things? Oh, these are drum machines and those sort of things. I was putting like each piece together. And so what I would do is I just was getting magazines, Keyboard Magazine at the time, released this book called The Analog Synthesizers Handbook. And I think it was like presented by Mark Vail, who's one of the writers at Keyboard at the time. But this book was a pretty thick book that had pretty much any iconic analog synthesizer that's ever been released up until that point in time was published in this book. And it had really interesting articles and anecdotes about these synths and how they were used in major films and in, you know, different projects, and other famous artists that use these synthesizers like Herbie Hancock and other people that I've been really influenced growing up. And I remember it being just such like an important guide for me. It was kind of like my Bible at the time. And I was like, whoa. I remember reading this little caption of that Ben Burt, who's one of my all-time heroes. I don't know if you guys know Ben Burt, but Ben's a sound designer who he's the iconic sound designer who did all the sounds in Star Wars, Indiana Jones, the original Star Wars films in the early 70s. They made the the Lifesaver sounds to, I mean, all these incredible sounds that we know today. But not only that, like he's gone on to do much more incredible stuff. I was just watching WALL-E the other night with my kids, and I think Ben won an Academy Award. It was the first time a sound designer won an Academy Award for that film, because it was all, he did the voices of Eva and WALL-E. And the sound design in that is just absolutely incredible. I don't know if you guys got a chance to listen to it, but check it out. But yeah, so Ben was a huge influence. I remember being such a big Star Wars nerd, reading a caption in that book where it said, hey, to make the sounds of R2D2, I was using an ARP 2600 synthesizer with my voice controlling an envelope follower and a ring modulator and all this stuff. I was like, oh my God, I've got to get this synth that made the sounds for R2D2. That's absolutely amazing. And lo and behold, I remember a couple months later, just driving down Highway 41, because I used to hit these pawn shops. There'd be like 20 of them back then. Now they're all gone. They're like, it's all changed now. But I used to go down different strips, different areas that had just these hotbeds of stuff where just stuff would just be popping up. There were studios all around the Atlanta area that were letting go of a lot of this stuff, because back then in the early 90s, no one wanted analog stuff. Like that was pretty much looked at as like garbage, like because everyone was shifting into like Pro Tools workstations, and the computers were just starting to kind of take hold in the studio. It was more now, it was becoming more of a centerpiece as like your sequencing sort of center. Even though like the digital audio part wasn't fully there yet, a lot of people were taking interest. And also the sound that people were looking for at that time was much more, they wanted realistic sounds. People didn't want these emulations of things that were realistic, like, like the 808 drum machine, or you look at these iconic old drum machines, they were all trying to emulate like real instruments, using analog circuitry or just using the technology that they had available at the time. So a lot of these machines were getting dumped at these secondhand shops, and that's where I was getting at this stuff. And luckily, the music that I was interested in wanting to make, they were using a lot of the same equipment. So I was able to get this stuff for super cheap. I bought 808s and 606 303s, 909s, like all of this stuff for nearly nothing. Like I still have my Jupiter 6 here that I only paid $400 for, a couple of Juno 106s that I paid like, I make the joke, I paid Behringer prices for these original synthesizers that they're emulating today. Back then, I just held on to a lot of them. And so I learned them. For me, it was about the first most important thing for me was to learn how to use these things and it be more of like an education. I looked at it, I was like, what can I learn about synthesis by this synthesizer? Like why this company designed this synth this way. And number two was like, I want to be able to make music with this. Ultimately, the most important thing is like, I want to get some great sounds. I want to be able to incorporate this in my tracks. And I wanted to figure out which synthesizer or synthesizing method or approach would work best for the way that I write music. So I was still kind of experimenting and trying to figure these things out. And at that time I was buying a lot of early sequential circuit stuff like the 6-track Prophet 600. I had the Prophet VS, which was really cool with Dave Smith's collaboration. Vector synthesis, which was a whole new form of synthesis that I was just discovering. But there was a lot of these great synths that I picked up during that period that like I said, it was a kind of a renaissance for me. It was really a period of discovery and research and really trying to understand these things and then trying to understand how I would make music with them and trying to find the strengths and weaknesses of each instrument. So I was trading a lot of these instruments. I was selling some off and then keeping some and I would record with them. I just would record. Back then I was recording to these 2-hour DAT tapes. These digital audio DAT tapes, which people are like, what's a DAT tape, Rich? So there's like these magnetic tapes are about this big, and we'd have to record to a DAT machine that would have, analog inputs on the back, and I would plug everything into my like analog mixing desk, and then from that it goes straight. I think I was using like a compressor limiter too out of that, which was a whole other thing of stuff that I had to learn about. It was all these weird things you have to buy, like stuff that you would say, like if you're using Ableton or I don't know, any of these modern DAWs, all that stuff's built in, these concepts and stuff. But back then, all of these things were sort of like loose things you kind of had to figure out and find out you do tons of recordings. I remember like taking my stuff to the club and I'd bring my DAT machine to the club and plug it into a DJ mixer and test my mixes out, play my DAT tapes and just be like, oh my God, this sounds horrible. Why is it sound so bad? I'd be sitting there with like a notepad taking notes like, all right, so those compressor settings didn't work. Now, why did that not work? It was like all these, it was so things that you would find out in probably like less than a day would literally take me like months to figure out by stumbling through trial and error, so things happen at a much slower rate. And, when you did finally, have a success, it was like a big success. You're like, oh my God, I discovered something today. I've been doing this thing wrong for months and now I know why. And that happened a lot. That was like a big thing. But yeah, so that's more or less how I built my studio back then, was buying a lot of secondhand stuff. And I collected a lot of great pieces back then. I started calling colleges, different universities around the US at that time. I'd call them up on the phone. It's like, hey, you guys got any old analog gear you want to get rid of out of your studios? And I got a lot of great stuff. Got like EMS Synthy, AKS, got the Electro Comp, EML 101, Modular. It's like semi-modular synth. I had like two 2600s or 2500, 6-panel Surge, Modular. This is the first concept of modular to me was getting into these synths at that time, like at the age of 17. Back then, was when I was like, whoa, this format is really vastly different than just like a monophonic, additive subtractive synthesizer, that's, you have a bunch of fixed parameters. You really can't, you can change things via faders and knobs, but you really can't restructure the signal flow of the way things interact with each other. So the whole concept of a modular synthesizer to me back then was a really radical idea. And I'd gotten so many crazy sounds out of those synths back then. And for me, I was like, I don't know why I I'm always going to have this sort of instrument in my arsenal. I know going forward. I think the ARP 2600 was probably the most instrumental instrument at the time that shifted my synth, my synth focus. I said, a lot of my friends are like, oh, I'm getting a Juno 106 or Jupiter this or whatever. And I remember getting the ARP and I was like, man, this thing just gets so crazy. Every time I turn it on, it's like does some different thing. Sometimes I can't even get the thing that I just I patched up last night. And, I felt like it had this organic quality to it where, especially the electrocomp and the EMS was also one of my favorites. I used to take the EMS Synthy around with me all the time. It was a portable suitcase. I would just take a pair of headphones. And my mom owned a restaurant that I worked at. I was a cook at her restaurant. So I used to set up like these mini studios on her refrigerator in the back food supply room, storage room. And so I'd have like a Synthy back there with headphones and like an R8 drum machine. And I'd make music back there. And it was, it was super hot. I remember it was always like 90 to 100 degrees. Sometimes like sweating, playing with my Synthy, just learning how to use it. And I remember just like, I learned so much during that time. And it really changed my focus and my direction of like what instruments I would use going into the future. And it also changed the way that I approach things. Cause I know a lot of people, they ask me like, when the whole Eurorack thing started to explode, they're just like, whoa, man, how did you get so good at Eurorack stuff? And I was like, well, I actually was playing with modular stuff long before Eurorack came out. And the concepts are really not that much different. You're just kind of applying it to the same sort of techniques. And I bought my first Eurorack in 2005. So I kind of got in pretty early when I bought my first. Back then it was just Dofer. It was Dieter's Dofer stuff was the only thing available.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd like to sort of ask you there because it's interesting to know that you had this background with the ARP 2600 and the Synthy and this before the kind of computer music sort of heyday, and then the analog revival. Because it's like a lot of people who make whatever similar music or who are in this same world, their trajectory is more like maybe coming up in a kind of computer music moment and then wanting to get away from that. And then their first kind of exposure to analog synths comes in this like 2000s to now moment. But you're kind of having this experience before that. So I'd love to hear about the early days that you're about to talk about with Dofer. But I'm also curious about computers and how they come into the equation for you. In terms of like software modular or things like Reactor or whatever other because I know that's a big part of what you've done over the years. So, but by all means, go in whatever direction you want to go.
Oh yeah, no, these are all great questions. Yeah, the computer was always really there. I think my first computer I bought was in college at Kennesaw. I bought a Mac SE2. Probably those of you probably don't even remember. You could look them up and you'll probably laugh at what that looks like. But yeah, I remember a friend of ours, a friend of one of my good friends, me and Matt, we met this guy, Don Hassler, who used to teach at the Atlanta College of Art. And Don's a great guy. I've been friends with him many years. And Don introduced me to, Don was also a big modular user. He was using Synthes, and actually the reason why I met Don was through my Synthy purchase. I was looking for more pins because I had a bunch of damaged pins that came with my Synthy, and I needed to get more. And I remember looking in that analog synthesizer handbook, there was actually a page about EMS synthesizers, and there was a contact rep for the US, and it was Don's name. And it said Snellville, Georgia. And I was like, holy shit, there's a guy here that works for EMS and he lives in Georgia. Well, I've got to meet this guy. And then I don't remember what year this was. Don this is probably, I want to say mid 90s, maybe 96, 95, around that time. And I gave Don a call, and he, super funny guy. He's like, oh yeah, so tell me about yourself. I'm like, yeah, I'm just a young guy trying to make electronic music. And first thing Don asked me, he's like, are you interested in selling your synth? And he's like, oh no. I want to make music with this thing. He was like, you're not a collector? I'm like, nope, not a collector. I purely want to make sounds. I want to make music with this stuff. My goal is to like make a record with this thing, but I need to get more pins because I don't have enough pins. And he's like, well, you should come down and meet me at the Atlanta. You need Atlanta Art Institute or wherever he was at the time. He had set up a sound lab. It was like a sound. What was it? I can't remember the name of his class, but he taught an experimental sound teaching class at the Atlanta College of Art. So there would be like students there that would do these art projects, art installation projects if they wanted to use sound. Don would teach these classes, which was great. And in his classroom, he had I believe it was like 5 or 6 Mac computers set up there. And he had a Dofer system. He had an MS-20. He had a bunch of other modular-esque, semi-modular and modular-based systems there. So when I came to meet him there, it was really interesting. I remember kind of looking at the computers. I was like, well, what kind of stuff do you teach on the computers? I was like, I came mostly from a hardware background, and I remember Don showing me Super Collider and Sound Hack on this early Mac. I don't remember what maybe they were Mac Quadras. They were Mac Quadra workstations. There, and I remember hearing Super Collider when he played me a couple of the patches that run in the internal library, and I remember just being like, holy shit, I had no idea that the computer could sound, the synthesis just within a computer was capable of sounding so sophisticated and so organic and so non-linear. Like it was all these things that were just completely polar opposite of what I had heard other people do with computers. I just wasn't aware of that. I just didn't know these things existed. And then he showed me another environment called C Sound. And that also really blew me away. I started looking at all these objects in the C Sound package, and it was free. You could download C Sound for free, and you can still download C Sound for free. It's completely free to run. And at the time, Super Collider wasn't free. James McCarthy was charging for it, but now it's free. You can also download Super Collider, which I still tell people you should check out. It's absolutely incredible still to this day. The development has kept going, and there's a great community around it. And I've been using Super Collider again because I've been getting back into using the computer, using title cycles and live coding. And I'm now using Super Collider with this interface called Super Dirt, which communicates with title cycles, and that becomes your IO interface with like this. It's a whole world of stuff. But anyways, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, so it was really interesting. Kind of opened my eyes to, like, I was like, whoa, I started to take the computer a bit more seriously after I heard that. And then I was like, all right, I'm going to get a Mac, and I'm going to start running some of these programs and just see what happens, and see if I can combine that with what I've been doing in the hardware world. And I took a deep dive into that. I went all, I made like 4 albums all on the computer and did everything with like from, field recording processing to synthesizing. There were whole like Super Collider patches that were just that for some of my tracks. Like I was doing a lot of stuff. Then I was using CDP, another program called Composer's Desktop Project that was based out of the UK, which was another secret weapon that was all DOS command prompt line coded, apps where you had to know the syntax of like different objects that were calling from this library of 200 objects that you could use in different combinations, and very sophisticated sound processing environment. And now that used to be a paid package, and now that's also free. So if you guys are interested in checking that, I highly recommend looking at that. It's a very cool package of sound processing environment if you're looking to do very sophisticated sound effects or motifs or things within a music composition. You can also use it to create music. So I got really heavy into all this, and I still am. I still really am into all this. And I'd say like 1999, I discovered Generator, which was pre-Reactor from Native Instruments. And I was so struck by Generator just because of the GUI, the graphical interface was beautiful, the way you could use these different style of knobs. And I was also using PC computers at the time. I was using PC and Mac. I was cross-platform. I think I bought my first like Toshiba or Gateway. I can't remember what it was. And was starting to use Generator and some of these other programs that were coming out on PC, because there was some really cool stuff coming out on Windows that wasn't coming out on Mac. And then there was only stuff that was coming out on Mac OS that wasn't available on Windows. And I was like, well, I got to have both, because there's too many cool things happening in both places not to have to play around with each of these things that were being created. So there was like, once again, it was like a Renaissance thing sort of happened. Like there was this explosion. Native Instruments came out like the early 2000s. I remember they released the Pro 53, which was like an emulation of the Prophet 5 and the Hammond B3. And people really started to take the computer seriously. A lot of serious studio around the world were like, oh shit, they've actually made a virtual instrument that's like a high dollar $5,000, $6,000 classic vintage synthesizer, and they brought it into the virtual world. Now we've got complete automation capabilities and all these things that come with using something in a digital audio environment that really reaps the benefits of that. And it sounds great. They really kind of I didn't realize at the time when I came on board with Native Instruments, there was 6 people at the company. I played a show in Berlin at the Volkswagen Theater or the old VMF club. I can't remember if it was the old VMF. I played so many shows in Berlin, but Mata Galek, who is now the CTO of Native Instruments, he back then was the artist relations rep at NI, and he came to my show with with a few of his friends. And he's like, "Well, we've got to work with you." And he saw that I was using Generator Live. He's like, "That's amazing. I'm not seeing anyone using our products in a live setting." And because I built this sequencer, sampler, mangler, and drum machine-ish box that I was using to do my shows back then. And they're like, you should come to our office. And so I did. I came and met with Daniel and I met Egbert and all the guys that were working at NI at the time. There's only 6 people in this small little office space with these computers, and that's all it was. And I was like, this is cool, man. This is like an underground, cool little, like, kind of like had this like hacker vibe to it, I was like, these dudes are cool, man. Yeah. And they're like, yeah, we're just starting to, we'd love to work with you and collaborate with you. And, if you would be interested in collaborating with us and making some sounds, we really dig the sounds you make. So I started to create content and sounds for a lot of their products, which was like the first version of Battery. Battery. We did Contact, the Contact expansion libraries. And then eventually we did Absinthe with my friend Brian. Brian had his own software company going. He was as Absinthe 1.0, but I showed Absinthe to Mata, and then Mata was like, "Hey, we should release this. We should help your friend Brian out. This product is cool enough to put out in our catalog." So they released that. Eventually went to FM7, Massive. I stayed and I worked on factory content and presets and programming, as well as making patch content, all kinds of stuff for them for almost every release. And so I stayed working, and I worked with them for almost 21 years. The last project I finished up with them was Massive X, was the most recent version of Massive, which I did over, and I think 128 presets that are in the factory library right now for them. And then we did 2 expansion packs after that were in the 50 to 60 sounds that I did for them that are also out right now. But yeah, they were a great company. And like I said, I didn't know they were going to be this huge company. I just hopped on back in 2001. Hey, you guys are cool. And then of course this whole software revolution happened. That first wave going into the early 2000s, that really, when the whole laptop performance idea started to really be a thing. I started playing shows on my laptop back then. I was doing, shows on an old Wall Street G3 PowerBook 66 or 166 megahertz. I don't remember what it was, but it was pretty low on the scale of high performance. But back then we were able to do it. I was using old version of Logic Audio to sequence my shows, and I think I was using Cubase for a while. They called it Cubase VST back then, which would allow you to do like 32 tracks. And eventually I moved to Logic because I wanted the more tidier MIDI resolution timing and stuff. But yeah, it was an interesting time period. And, I did that. And then it's funny, like you said, going back full circle, in 2011, 2012, I started to be like, oh man, I really miss making records, making music by hand with hardware. Like I was just really sick of clicking around it just was like single point manipulation of parameters through software, which isn't a bad thing because you can automate things and there's lots of benefits to working in the computer, but you lose that tactile physical interaction with an instrument, that intimate thing that can happen when you just are moving things by your hands and making dozens of adjustments with, different knobs and faders and things, where you can find these sweet spots really quickly, which you can get there much faster than you can with a mouse. And I kind of forgot that. I think I just kind of got in that headspace where I'd like gotten so deep with the computer DSP stuff that I forgot about how fun it was just to sit down with like an instrument and play it. And I was like, wait a minute, like maybe I'm missing the whole point of it all by how deep I dived into all this. And maybe that's why it's become such a lackluster thing for me lately. Maybe I need to get back to that. So I started using modulars and hardware synthesizers and things again. And I was like, I feel like I was back in the beginning, like making all these tracks all the time. Like I was like more productive. I wasn't getting hung up on things in the computer where I was just like, oh, well, I can save this track. I'll just come back to it. So I'd start all these hundreds of tracks that I just, mentally in my head, I'll be like, I'll get back to this just because I could save it. I could go back to it. But knowing me, like I'd be like, I never go back to this. Months would go by and I'd forget that I even made it. And I was like, what is this thing? I'm like in this folder. Oh, I remember this track. And I was like, well, maybe I need to break out of my old habits. And maybe making music with hardware will break some of these bad habits that I was doing in the computer. So I started to build up a system. And I was like, my goal with my Eurorack system is like, I want to be able to design a system that will allow me to make music very quickly. Like I want to be able to generate something in less than an hour, and either good or bad, either recorded or not recorded, but, have something that's, good enough or not good enough. Sometimes you have successes, sometimes you don't. But yeah, I was like, I'm going to design a system to write music and write an album on, and I'm going to do it all by hand. I'm not going to use a computer. Well, I'll use a computer, but I'll use the computer as a tape recorder. It'll just capture everything at the end of the day. And all the other process will all be done with my ears and my two hands. And that really was kind of like the beginning of me going back. And that's where I've been most recently kind of exploring. But now I'm actually kind of going back into the computer with hardware, because there's some interesting things happening now with generative instruments, AI-based technology, and machine learning. I've been getting into a lot of machine learning-based stuff. And now I'm fascinated with that. I'm just fascinated with anything that'll make me do something a bit different, that'll break me out of my old habits. And I think that's always been kind of an ongoing thread with me, is like, break out of your old habits, do something different, do something new, and see what happens. You know what I mean? There's no right or wrong. There's no trying to, be in a certain scene or be on a current sound or whatever. It's just constant exploration to find something new. I think that's my quest that people see me going on, and kind of experience in my social media, is me looking for new tools and things to satisfy those, I don't know, those urges to want to do something new and different musically.
Yeah, it's a great ethos. It reminds me, there's some quote from Guy from Back to Fugazi where they're asking about what hardcore is or something, and he says, hardcore means keep moving, like never settle.
Yep.
And like that, to me, that's like the mantra, and it's easy
totally
to fall into these ruts, and I think anybody, even people who have a later, we're coming onto the scene later than the story you're telling, but many of us have similar trajectories in our own, arcs, where we end up in this computer world, and the level of control, there's this like rational control of the timeline, and it's so precise, but then you
totally
have a folder with 100 unfinished things, so yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, yeah. I don't want people to get the wrong idea. Like, the computer, I think, is still the most sophisticated instrument in the world. I think if you really don't have any other gear, I mean, if you were to tell me if all I could take was one instrument with me on an island, I'd take my laptop and mouse and a pair of headphones. That's all I need. I could do anything. I could do anything with that. That's all I need, really. I don't want people to get the wrong idea. Like, I think having gear is fun, but I don't think it's going to solve, people's problems, or like, it's really the most important thing really is just the ideas that you come up with, the ideas and things that come musically that happen in a track or a piece or a demo or whatever you're working on. It's those ideas and those concepts I think are more important than sometimes the technology behind it. And sometimes the technology can help you, that can come up with these cool ideas. And I think that's why I'm always looking for things that help me come up with cool new ideas. And I think it really, really stems to that. It's not about having the latest this thing or that thing, and I think people maybe think that I get hung up on that, but I don't really. It's not really about that for me. It's about more of the new generative possibilities, the new things that you could discover about yourself, or about doing something a different way that teaches you something that you're like, oh, I never thought to do that, or that's so cool that what it just did right there, or it's
and that's the spirit of this. We talk about sometimes with the Synth Club, with synthesis and with modular, that these are concepts. These are like philosophical orientations, not just particular gear. It's about these new connections and possibilities for creativity. It's great Absolutely. To hear someone like you who is sometimes so associated with the like huge system and has all these great synths, and it's great to hear someone like you talk about, well, technically all I need is a laptop and a pair of headphones. Like, I can break it down to that. But we do love gear, and we do want to talk about gear.
Sure.
So I want to circle back now, because we started to talk about Eurorack, and a lot of people who are watching this or who will watch it will know about Modular. They'll have seen it. Many of them may have modular systems, but not everyone knows the kind of history of this. And so we've already talked about how you had this interest in modular synths prior to this Eurorack boom. And then we started to talk about Doepfer. And then there's this moment in the first decade of the 2000s, so about 12, 13 years ago now maybe, where some other companies start popping up to supplement the Doepfer system. So I know Tony from Make Noise had said that one of his original ideas was just to add modules to his Doepfer system. I believe that Harvestman, now Industrial
Scott.
I can't remember that, Scott Yeager, whatever the company's called now. It's Harvestman to me, but whatever.
Yeah, no, you're right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he had a similar thing of creating a module that would, So I kind of cut you off earlier. So I'd love to hear you explain. Did you get into the Doepfer stuff before that intense computer music period and then return to it? Or was that the beginning of the kind of, I'm going to build a Eurorack system? And I guess talk about then from there where you went with Eurorack and that stuff.
Sure. Yeah, no, the Doepfer stuff came sort of after I started to kind of come out of the computer stuff. I was like, I needed something that was a little more tactile. And actually, my friend Josh, I was visiting him in Miami at his studio, and he is one of my best friends, longtime best friends, part of this group called Phoenicia on Schematic Records and Warp, and admired Josh, such a great musician. And I remember he was the first person to dive into the Eurorack Doepfer stuff. And I remember going to his studio one night, and he's like, hey, Rich, I just picked up my first two systems. I spent about 6 months building these two G6 cases, and check it out. And I remember we ate a bunch of mushrooms, and we played with his Eurorack modular for, I want to say, like 13, 14 hours, and recorded a bunch of crazy stuff. And I remember I went there. I came directly from the airport, from Miami International Airport, and drove straight to his studio. And we didn't even like dinner. We just like had a bunch of mushrooms and trip balls and played on his Eurorack for like 13 hours. And I was just like, okay, all right, I'm sold. I'm going to go home. I'm going to look at the Doepfer catalog, and I'm going to buy me two G6 cases and start looking at stuff. And I remember he did have one non-Doepfer module. He had the Analog Solutions. was it the comb resonator? There was I think it was a comb resonator module that he had in there. So there was some other manufacturers at the time making stuff. And I remember it was Analog Solutions and Schwayman, because I bought some Schwayman modules at that time too. And when I bought my systems, I bought a lot of similar stuff that Josh bought. And I remember we were really big on the BBDs, like the Bucket Brigade delays. They were incredible. And Josh had two. I ended up buying two. Then we both got another one. Then we had like 6 at one point, and they were all using different chipsets. Like there was the 128, 256, a 512. BBD chips, so they were basically delay lines that would spread out longer delay lines, and the smaller the delay line, like the 120, the tighter the delay lines would be up, so you could do like harpless strung synthesis type stuff. And so we were diving in deep back then. It was and for me it was so refreshing to have a system. And to me, this is what really blew me away about Eurorack back then in 2005, was I was like, whoa, so you basically start out with an empty case, because there was nothing at the time that would allow you to customize and build your own synth, other than like building something in the computer, like with Max MSP or Reactor, where you're calling different objects and connecting them together with these virtual cables. Here, you actually had physical circuitry that you could arrange and plug in any order. And that concept to me was just mind-blowing. I looked at Josh and I was like, wow, this is amazing. You spec'd out this system that you've designed specifically to your needs. So it's like your synth. This is like your perfect, synthesizer. And Josh is like, yeah, it's exactly, this is the whole point of it. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. There wasn't any modular grid back then, or, stuff where you could plan your case. And so I basically was speccing all this out on like sheets of paper, and like thinking in my head, I'm like, what would I use? What would I want? What am I lacking with my other synths that I could make this synth excel at? So yeah, I went ahead and built up, fairly quickly. I filled up 2 cases as very fast, as most people know with Eurorack stuff. That's how it goes. And even back then, that's how it went. And I was blown away. The possibilities were just, I was just floored with all the different sounds I was getting. What was neat is I was able to interface it with some of my older synths. I was connecting my Dofer into my ARP 2600. It was controlling my ARP and some of my other synths here. So it became this really, really interesting focus point. And right around that time, my friend Josh moved from Miami up to Asheville, North Carolina, with his parents, where they were building a new house. And we had met Tony Rolando right at this time. And I don't know how Josh met Tony, but Josh's like, hey, Rich, I just met this guy, Tony. He works for Moog. Tony used to work at Moog. He moved down from New York with Kelly, and there was a job opening at Moog as like a tech on the Voyager line. It was something like that. I can't remember what the position that he applied for there. So he applied for this position. They moved out to Marshall, this place called Marshall, North Carolina, which is about, at the time, it was about 35 minutes from the Moog factory, the old Moog factory, not the new one. And Tony started working there. And then Josh was like, hey, you should meet this guy Tony I've been hanging out with. He's the only other guy that I know in North Carolina that's into like synths. And he's got a Eurorack too. He's got a G6 case like us. And Josh went ahead and bought a monster case. Like he bought a big case. And we were really into it that time. It's like, yeah, there's somebody else that's into Eurorack stuff. Let's meet this guy Tony. So we used to go to Tony's place and drink whiskey and get drunk and play on Modular, our Euroracks. We just bring them all in a room. And I was like, yeah, this Tony guy is really cool. And this is before Tony had decided to build anything. And I didn't know Tony was already reading up about building his own circuits and stuff. And then Tony mentioned this one night. He's like, hey, you know what? You guys, because we used to let Tony borrow modules. I'd let him borrow stuff of mine. And Josh, we'd always trade stuff just to check out things. And back then, the only place you could get stuff at was Analog Haven through Sean Cleary. So there wasn't any other stores at the time or anything that were selling the stuff, or if you had to order direct from Germany to get the Dofer stuff. And I remember Tony saying, hey, I'm going to work on I think I'm going to build some of this stuff. I've been reading about this stuff. I don't think it'd be that hard to build anything. And we're like, oh, that's really cool. And Tony started sketching out plans for a passive ring modulator, which became his first module, the Mondamix, or the original Mondamod, or whatever it was called. And and then we were the first guinea pig testers. Me and Josh were for Tony, and Tony was just soldering this stuff on a table in his house in the back corner of his room. You know, that was Make Noise back then, and or before there was even Make Noise. And then I was there with Tony for almost every module that was released. I remember Mass, and then the QMMG. The QMMG actually was an interesting story. I don't know if Tony remembers this, but my friend Josh showed Tony this plugin by a company called Anarchy Rhythms. I don't know if you guys remember that plugin or not, but it's a interesting plugin that's sort of like it's basically like a QMMG. You could take incoming audio. It's like having 4 MIDI MRFs in a box where you could, you know, have different filter types, and then you could sequence the filter types on 4 different channels. So you could do these cool. We would make entire drums out of any signal with Anarchy Rhythms plugins. I remember when Josh showed that to Tony. Tony's like, "Oh, that's a really interesting concept that, you know, you're showing me here." And Josh was like, "This would be so cool to have like an analog, like modular version of this plugin." So Tony was like, "Well, let me see what I can think of." So, you know, Tony was already looking at using Vactrals at the time, and then he came up with this first prototype of what became the QMMG, which was the, you know, quad multi-filter or multi-pass, low-pass gate. And because we were loving the digital low-pass gates, like, and you could do in the Anarchy Rhythms, because you can make a kick drum, like a pitched envelope with resonance and stuff. You could do like these really pitchy, sort of like lasery sort of snares and stuff. And that's like what we were looking for, because we were trying to make that percussion stuff. And then Tony's like, "Well, check this out. Check out this thing that I built." And then we were like, "Whoa, this is awesome." And, you know, and like, "Oh, the Vactrals sound really cool." And and it went from there. And I remember I actually even helped Tony with the Woggle Bug. He borrowed my wired original Grant Richter's, whatever the big Woggle Bug I had, the dual Woggle Bug from the wired modular system. I'd let Tony borrow that for like 2 years or something. And I was like, I told Tony, I was like, "I absolutely love this wired." I mean, I just had it in my studio because I would hook it up to I was hooking it up to my Eurorack and to my ARP. And because it was the dual version, I could like split off signals. I could like feed it into itself and get these complicated, crazy randomized, like, I don't even know what you want to call it, but it was amazing. And Tony's like, "Oh, let me borrow that." And I was like, "Dude, totally borrow it. Let's build one in Eurorack, dude." And then he asked Grant Richter. He's like, Grant said, "Sure, yeah, give permission. The only thing I ask that you don't do is you don't make a dual version that competes against my version." Tony's like, "Cool." And that's how the Woggle Bug came out. And so, yeah, there's a lot of back stories that people backline stories that they don't know, that, you know, me and my friend Josh were there along the way helping Tony kind of concept and come up with some of these sort of things. And I still talk to Tony even to this day. You know, every few days we text and stuff, and he's such a great close friend of mine. Really close friends of my family. Like when we go to Asheville, we stay with Tony and Kelly all the time, and we love them. But there were other people. You mentioned Scott. Scott was also another person that we met early on. Scott Harvestman. Or Scott Yeager when it was Harvestman, now Industrial Electronics. But Scott was another person that helped out a lot, doing a lot of testing, and still stay pretty close to him. And there was another person, Mike Brown, who passed away, unfortunately, a good friend of mine who ran Livewire Electronics, who was another one. They were like some of the first emerging manufacturers on the scene. And through Don actually knew Mike Brown, and this guy named Peter Grenader, who later became Plan B. But originally, Mike Brown and Peter were in a company together called Ear Acoustics, and they were going to release modules together. But because there were some disagreements on what was what, Peter decided to go in his own way and start Plan B Modular. Mike went his own way and started Livewire. I stayed friends with both of them. Every time I would go to LA, I'd visit them. And anytime they'd work on concepting a new module, I would go visit them, and then I would take one of those modules home. And so, yeah, I was pretty much there right at the beginning when all this started, and was talking regularly with all of the early modular manufacturers, because I was just like, well, and this is when it was very underground. There was no one really into this stuff, especially the American or the US based Euro designers. So I became friends. And then shortly after that, I met Dan from 4MS from Austin, when he was in Austin. Now they're in Portland. When he started sending me, he started making pedals at first. And then like Tony just was like, hey, I think I can make some of this Eurorack stuff. And I met Dan and started testing a lot of his stuff, because I started posting videos on Vimeo at the time. And then Gurr from Tip Top Audio reached out to me, who I'm still great friends with. Like it started to, it was really accidental. I was like, hey, this stuff's cool. I started posting stuff, I don't know, it was like 12, 13 years ago, or however long it was. And, and just kind of documenting stuff. And there wasn't a whole lot of people documenting this stuff back then. I think my friend James Sigler was doing stuff. James was doing stuff under Felix. He had an old site. There was like 2 or 3 people that were doing stuff. And I met James early on too, who I'm still friends with to this day. James is great. But yeah, it was a really, really small scene, really niche, really boutique people that were into this stuff back then. And I just saw really great potential in it. I was like I said, I'm just naturally have an inquisitive mind about innovative new things that can make you make new sounds or approach making sounds in a new way. And I saw this as an opportunity even back then. It's like, this is a really cool thing. I'm going to stick with this. And I just stayed along for the ride. And, look at where we're at now. I had no idea that it was going to explode into something as big as it is now. It's really, really just beyond exploded my expectations. And even now when I go to Super Booth every year in Berlin, I'm like, wow, it's officially graduated to me. It's like mainstream now, It's no longer the underground cool thing that me and a couple of my buddies would just get together on the weekends and drink whiskey and patch and learn about modular synthesis. And it's now on a bigger scale, so to speak. But that's not a bad thing. I want all my friends to do really well. I'm super happy that all of my friends have been able to make really good livings designing these instruments. And I always tell people that it's like, you should support these people if you can, because it makes, at the end of the day, it allows you to do really cool things, whether they're a plugin manufacturer, an iOS developer, or a module maker. Like if they're making something cool, it's like, support the people that can support you to do cooler stuff. Because at the end of the day, it's like this, yeah, it's a great community. That's a really, really great community of people that make this stuff. I love all of them. And yeah, I don't even know how to explain it, but yeah, it's a pretty crazy backstory coming up to present day. But yeah, they're all doing great.
It's great to hear, and you've been along this path that we've talked about, where I think some of the things that you were involved in earlier have then had ripple effects later, because, your work with Native Instruments, you among many people, right? It grew from a 6-person team to a very big team. But, some of these soft synths they created, things like Massive, for people like me, my generation, that was where we learned how to make. That was our first synthesizer, right? Or maybe we had a microKORG or something, but Massive is where we were like really, and that primes and the industry waves of, okay, then we start getting these Volcas, we start getting the micro brutes, and then people like me can afford it, and then we're like, I lived in New York at the time, and I'm like, I don't want to get my micro brute from a big, corporate store. Let me go support the synth shop in Brooklyn. So then I go into Control, and I'm like, and here I am, right?
I love Control.
Yeah, and so and that was in part, that's a couple years after what you're talking, the early days of Eurorack. So that these cycles continue, but I would love to just keep going on my questions, because I could talk about so many things, but we are at the 3:30 mark, and I wanted to try to get the chat questions a bit, and then leave a little bit of time at the end before you have to sign off to talk about what you're doing right now and what you're excited about in the future. Although
Sure.
there were some questions already wanting to go there because everyone wants to talk about the new exciting stuff. So maybe we'll get into
Sure.
that and organically, and we won't even need to pivot. But I'm going to go back through the chat because we had a couple earlier ones. So one was actually about like recording and workflow. Yeah. So I don't know if it's ALV. Alvesevsa. Sorry, I don't know how you say your name. Anyway, they said, question. I'm interested on the workflow approach with production with Modular. For the live and studio sessions, do you start often with something particular, drums for example? And they said, thanks. Hope to be here for the answer because my daughter is going mad. They may not even be here, but it could be a question for everyone. So sort of like, where do you begin? And maybe that varies, but do you have a kind of general way that you start when you're making music with Modular?
Sure, yeah. I tell them my response is I totally understand. I have a 4-year-old son and an 8-year-old daughter, so no worries. Kids can be crazy. My kids are crazy, and yeah, I understand. So to answer your question, it's different every time. Sometimes I start out just kind of, I have an idea in my head, and I try to execute it, and I will maybe start patching or hooking a couple things up and see how close I get. Sometimes I get really close. Sometimes I'm not close at all. I'm super far off, and sometimes something wrong will happen, or I'll try to do something better and then I screw it up, but then I screw it up in a way to where it turns it into something completely different than what I originally intended it to be. And it turns out to be something cooler than what I was trying to do before. So it can go so many different directions, but typically I'll start out with like a sequence of some sort. I always think of like a tempo. I just think like tempos first, like, oh, maybe I'll do this, start something at 80 or 160 or, 135. I always think of like the basic groundwork first is like, where do I want the tempo to be? And then I'll build from there, whether that's like a melodic structure or some sequencing of sounds or maybe a rhythmic pattern. It's like I said, it's such an organic thing for me. It never really starts the same way. And, I never use like the same exact equipment. I'm always like moving things around and trying different things just to see if something new can happen. So, but typically I try to think tempo first, like I said, the tempo, and then it could be either like melodic sequence or a structural beat thing where I'm using some, drum synthesis machine or a combination of patching up, physical modules to do the synthesis or using like an analog rhythm or something. There's just so many options, it's just kind of whatever I'm emotionally feeling with at that moment.
Cool. I think that's a good answer. We had another question from NecroKick. What brand new or upcoming Eurorack modules are you excited about? And I would say if you want to even start with their verbatim question, but if then you want to talk about things besides Eurorack, why don't we just do that now rather than revisit new stuff? So what's kind of some stuff on the horizon? Obviously you can't break anyone's NDAs and talk about things that haven't been announced, but are there some things that you could talk about that you're excited about that's coming?
Well, I've got something that's actually coming today. DHL is supposed to drop it off. It's the Torso Electronics T1. I don't know if you guys know that. It's like a small black keyboard that is it's like parameter driven algorithms that with like musical constraints that allows you dynamic hands-on control over every aspect of a composition. It's like a generative sequencer that creates like Euclidean-based rhythms. You could do like repeating notes, arpeggiating patterns and melodic structures, and it's got all these like specific functions that allow you to do these really, really cool things on a generative scale. I'm kind of really getting into this like generative instrument space, but it's really cool. It's like you do chords, like 16 polyphonic tracks. It's like, I don't think it's like maybe a little bit bigger than like an OP1. It's not a big thing at all, but I'm really excited about that. It's supposed to arrive here soon. But yeah, I'm interested in all kinds of stuff, not just synthesis, but like different ways to play synthesizers, like MIDI filters or things like the MIDI looper from Bastille Instruments, or I just got the MRCC, which is this really cool MIDI routing box that allows you to do channel by channel MIDI filtering and apply different like arpeggiators and MIDI filters and randomizers and probability removers per channel and things like that. So, or, you know, ways to manipulate MIDI data to come up with new ideas. So I'm excited about that. If we're talking like hardware sort of based things, I would say, what were some of the newest things? I've got the Tasty Chips GR1 was really fun. I just recently got that. Really been digging the Waldorf Quantum, which is just such an awesome box. I worked on sound design for the Waldorf team on that and fell in love with that synth when I was working on that project. Actually, most of the synths that I have in my studio, I worked on them. That's why I have so many, because I've worked on so many design projects, and I usually keep them because I got to know them so well. And so I really don't have many synths other than stuff I've had since I've grown up, like maybe in like Jupiter 6 or Jupiter 8 or whatever stuff that I've had since, you know, grade school or high school. But all the other stuff, like the newer stuff, I've actually had a hand in working on the factory, you know, patches for. So if I had, because I put the time, invested the time to get to know these instruments so well, I can work really quickly with them. So I'm not spending my time scratching my head trying to figure out how to get sounds out of them. So I've just held on to all these synths that I've worked on. And, but yeah, some, you know, like I said, some of the newer favorite stuff that I've gotten into have been like the Vector synth has been a lot of fun too, which is this new tabletop synth that allows you, it has a touch screen on it. That's sort of a unique take on vector synthesis. That allows you to do these orbiting patterns that modulate into different spheres that allow to modulate to different timbre sets, and you get some really interesting new sounds out of that. That's been a cool new thing. And then I had mentioned, you know, my most recent kind of experimentation of you know, it's been doing a lot of live coding. I've been kind of getting into that lately with tidal cycles and using ES9 expert sleepers that I'm kind of using as like a gateway out into my Eurorack system and other hardware, using Super Collider, what I talked about earlier, because Super Collider connects into it using this library called Super Dirt. And that's been really a lot of fun because the sequencing capabilities of tidal cycles is absolutely so wild and absolutely insane that you could do like nested rhythms within rhythms, and you could just do things that would be really impossible to do in like a typical DAW or even typical sequencers. But there are some sequencers that are coming out right now, like I should bring this one up. That's really interesting. One of them is the Flux Sequencer, this one here. It's very, very interesting, which uses what's called temporal synthesis modulation. So you got like 4 channels. It's not plugged in, but this is really interesting. This is probably one of the most interesting Eurorack modules that's come out for me in like the last couple years.
And the brand is Flux, or the name of the module? Sorry.
IOL Labs is the name of the company, but if you type in Flux Sequencer in Google, this will pop up. This is very, very interesting what this can do. I don't know how to explain it, but some of the same things that I've been trying to do with the live coding world with tidal cycles, this sort of does. So you can do these modulated time scales where you have stuff where the rhythms cluster, and you can almost change using these temporal shapes. Like there's an LFO for every parameter that's in here. So you get LFOs that like influence the other channels in between each other. So the rhythms and stuff that you come up with are just stuff that you just wouldn't be able to come up with any other way. It gets so crazy and so out of control if you want it to be that. Or you could do very, very rigid structured sequencing with it too. But I feel that this does some things that are just completely batshit crazy amazing. And if you go to their website, they have some SoundCloud examples that let you hear some of what I'm talking about. you can do these like audio rate crescendos and crazy like spidery pattern sequencing that's just absolutely out of this world. So this to me is very, very I don't know, very interesting and doing something very different than what other sequencers are doing right now in the Eurorack world. And then there's another sequencer I really dig that my friend Jim Combs made. It's called by 512. He was the creator of numerology. And he's got a sequencer called Vector that's also really great that I have with an expander that's in the other room. That sequencer is also really great, but works a bit different than this. And that it does, it's got these random probability modes that are just absolutely fantastic for doing these regenerative. Like there's a lot of times where I like set up a patch and I wanted to just do this regenerative composition where it's like this endless composition that's constantly evolving and changing with non-repeating patterns. And you know, you could do this sort of thing, this very like Morton Subotnick style approach of sequencing with this sequencer. And it to me is fantastic. It's another one that's been a favorite of mine more recently. If we're talking like Eurorack realm stuff. Another one has been Teletype. I've been really getting to the modular stuff. That Brian Crabtree, I've been friends with Brian for many, many years, since like 2006 when I had the original Mono 256. And then I sold that and left the Mono world for a while when I was doing a lot of Max programming with that. And then he started to get into this Eurorack stuff. Now things are really interesting because now I'm using the Norins, which is this little DSP box that has dozens of DSP algorithms. You can do live coding in it as well. It's got the Orca environment running on it, all kinds of other really cool stuff. There's also community-based where you can download patches from other users that create different scripts and apps that they write for this. And there's well over a couple hundred different apps that run on this DSP box, and everything from like CV generators. You can use all of the mutable instruments DSP into this to all these interesting sort of things that, you know, you could try out even before coding your first thing, which is really great. And I've been having a lot of fun with that, with the Teletype module, which is a sort of like a live coding sequencing module. So you use it with a computer keyboard, and then you can use it with a Monome grid, which I've been kind of getting into, where you can write these scripts that do these very like sort of super crazy things, or like your non-typical sequencing approach things. And it's really been a lot of fun. I've been using that with the ER 301, they call it, or Brian calls it this, I guess, DSP computer sound canvas. That's what his term for that module is. But it's a super deep module that connects via it's a TICC or whatever, TCII interface protocol between the Monome. I have a Monome Crow module and some of the, I think I have the Three Sisters module in there, and I've got a Mutable Instruments Beats that I just got that's just in there as well. But most of the Monome stuff, I've got an Ansible as well, which connects with this protocol that you can hook up all of them together and control them through different devices. You can use the computer to interface stuff. You can have Macs, and it's really, really interesting. It's for me, I'm just looking for a new, interesting sequencing arrangement, song structure environments, so to speak, whether it's, you know, it's computer or Eurorack or some other piece of hardware. It's not really specific. I'm just kind of in this exploratory phase at this moment in time. But yeah, I guess if in a nutshell, those are a couple things that I'm excited about as far as Eurorack and hardware goes.
Lots of cool stuff. Yeah, that was great. And thanks to Colin in the chat. Richard, you probably can't see this, but we're sharing the links for everything you're talking about, so everyone can check
perfect.
them out. Support these companies.
Totally.
And we got a couple more questions in the chat. I have my own that I want to break into. But
sure, yeah.
I gotta respect the chat. This isn't just my one-on-one interview. So, how do you think the structure? Oh, this is from Extra Distress Reel. Extra Distress Reel. That's a great name. How do you think about the structure of a song as you are creating it with analog equipment? I think also just hardware in general, right? I find it easier to jam, they said, and then to be intentional about where the song is going in real time. So yeah, that's a do you have a kind of map of where you're going? Are you thinking about song structures when you're working with hardware stuff, or is it kind of more intuitive, like just finding finding your way as you go?
I'd say it's a bit of both. I've definitely mapped out like a trajectory of like things I wanted to do within a song. Like I did that a lot on my Sort Live record, where I had an idea and I had all these sounds that I wanted to play, and I had to figure out how it was all going to work. And because when I made that record, the most difficult part of everything of working, you're working on a modular, is being able to switch from one set of sounds to a whole different set of sounds. You either have to do it gradually over time and be changing things and to get from one point to another, or you just hook up multiple cases like I did. They all share the same clock, and then these cases all do a different thing at a different time in the composition. So I didn't, and I guess it depends on the intent of what you're trying to accomplish too. Like in my case, my objective was to have a song that would change organically, and the transitions would happen, but then you would have these different sounds that would immediately appear and happen and be already right in the mix and sit in the right frequency range and be, have their own sequence and part, and each place and part in the piece. So what I would do is I'd set a timer on my phone, and I'd say, all right, you got 7 minutes to play through all this. Let's practice through this. But it has to feel right, right? So that was the hardest part, was like trying to do all these different changes that I had planned for each part that each system would play, but having it feel natural. And I think that's the part where I struggled the most. It was like, how do I get it to feel not forced, where it's like it worked, where you listen to the piece of music and you're like, that's exactly how it should feel, like it emotionally carries you to this next segment or this next transition or to this next part of the song. It's kind of almost like telling a story or a mood or a feeling that you're trying to convey. So I guess I was driving it mostly through my emotional gut feelings, but setting all the parameters for that and trying to perform that and get that flow down, get the flow in the course of events to happen in a way that felt natural and not like, in the sense, I don't even know what that really means when it comes to my music, because it's not like a normal format. There's no, like, I guess natural to me, or to make it feel organic and not like I didn't want it to feel, I feel like I wanted the songs to evolve over time, like all those pieces. And even now, like I feel like I love the idea of like starting somewhere and ending up in some other completely different place within one track. And I think that was like a big part too of my process or working on that record. And even my most recent record, my is the Cystic EP with the acid tracks, which was just a live acid capture that I was going to play out in 2020, which just ended up being a record. But that also was kind of the same idea. You start, like, if you listen to those tracks, they start out at one point, and then by the end of the track, you're just like, is this even the same track? I mean, there's not even any trace of anything that was in the first 4 minutes. Now we're in some other, it sounds like we're in a completely different song, and then you skip in, like the first track is almost 20 minutes on that record. I know a lot of people are like, whoa, 20-minute track. I was like, I don't know what to tell you. I'm not trying to follow any rules here. I'm just kind of going with whatever happens and what feels right. And yeah, so that track, it's almost like 20 tracks in one. It just goes through so many different changes and evolves into different places and takes you to, like I said, it's just emotionally, I think it should be driven emotionally by how you feel and how you want the audience to feel. I think that's ultimately the most important thing. But yeah, I think, that's basically how I've done it, more or less. I don't know if I answered the question well or screwed that one up. But
no, that was great. I mean, it's a great question, and it's also one I think every artist is going to probably answer in their own way. So it's a really cool thing to think about, for sure. We have a couple more, so we want to try to get these in before we're
Sure.
done. I believe it's Jason, right? SysX Studio asked, what is your favorite utility module? So this could be hardware, software, modular, whatever. But in the modular reality, if you had to pick,
Much of the world.
if you had to think of a utility, what's your favorite? Not necessarily,
Shoot.
and maybe not. Maybe it's not a particular module, but a kind, like a VCA or something like this. I think that's what they're looking at.
Well, I mean, yeah, utility. I'm trying to think. There's so many. I'm trying to think here.
Their follow up was also by VCA or bipolar VCA, if you had to pick.
Oh, bipolar VCA for sure. Yeah, I use a lot. And I have a lot of VCAs too. I love VCAs. There's so many cool tricks you can do with them. But I'm just going to sound silly. I think I've mentioned this before, but a multiplier. I probably use multipliers, multiply signals, and multiply clocks, and multiply, control voltages across different, as simple as that is, I'd say the multiplier is the most used. I use buffered mults and unbuffered mults all the time to multiply signals across different, different modules and things. And it's you can multiply audio, you can multiply, like I said, gates, triggers, CVs. It's just a great way to spread a signal out across the system and test things out, and also try different variations on things. It's just something that I use all the time, and it's probably sounds super silly, but next to VCAs, it's I would say VCAs are number 2. Important for me, even more than filters. I know people are really heavy on filters, but I actually do more with I do a lot more with amplitude modulation than I do with filtering. So I'm always AM over FM these days, but that's not true too. I'm definitely big on FM too, but yeah, I would say definitely multiplier.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Shout out mults. This is
mults, it's simple.
Mults. That's awesome. No, it's totally true. And sometimes coming from some software environments where you can just infinitely do that, you may not appreciate it. But if you're coming from fixed architecture synths, the idea that you can send things wherever and also circle things back, and that's how you get the feedback. That's how so many cool interactivities come from the mult. It's a great answer.
Exactly.
Yeah, great answer. Next question. They said, this is from Kitva or Kitva. I don't know if the W is a V. I'm not sure where you're from. With Cortini having released a synth designed in collaboration with Make Noise, do you have plans to release a synth with your signature or maybe software related? So, I mean, this is an interesting question because in a way you've already you've already talked about it. You've been involved in the production of many synths and software, but in the way that maybe it's more of a, I don't want to say marketing, but in the way of the presentation of something that let's specifically, we're talking about the Strega, that was presented as this is a collaboration between the artist Alessandro Cortini and Tony Rolando, the designer. They are friends. They've worked together. But they have worked on this particular thing together, and this is coming out. So, do you have plans to do that, like a kind of Richard Devine and so, or is that something you're interested in doing?
That question's come up actually quite a bit over the last few years. A lot of people ask me if I were to collaborate with the synthesizer company. I would love to. I currently haven't had much time because I've had so much crazy stuff going on in my life. I just started working with Apple like 10 months ago. I'm their new senior content producer for audio music creation apps. So that's been a big shift, and I'm working on a lot of really cool, amazing stuff with them right now. I was previously working at Google for 4 years, and now I'm working with them. So I've always kind of had like a daytime sound design job and kind of crazy work on all the other stuff by night. But the I have been approached by a couple companies to do stuff. My dream actually is to create I'm really big in the drum synthesis, and I'd love to build like the ultimate drum synthesizer one day. Because there's so many drum synthesizers out there that I like that start really cool. They've got a couple of cool features, but then maybe they just don't finish everything out. And I have a bunch of favorites in the computer that I like. I have a bunch of hardware units that I like the Electron, rhythm and the Nord, like the Nord drums, certain things like that allow you to do like additive, subtractive synthesis and FM synthesis, AM synthesis, wavetable, or whatever. I'm looking for like that ultimate drum synthesizer that has like a very unique sequencing engine as well. You could interface with the computer, or you could use it with other instruments, but I just haven't seen. I've seen only a few products that are out there. It's kind of an area where there's not much happening. There's Joe Mox. You've got a couple other companies, but no one's really said, "Hey, I'm gonna make the ultimate drum synthesizing box." You could design any, drum synthesized percussion sound that you have in your head, using physical modeling, FM, AM, like I said, granular, whatever, something similar like the Quantum, but applying that whole.
Yeah, the Waldorf Quantum of drum synths. Yeah.
Drum synths, yeah, something along those lines, that would incorporate also like these, like an amazing generative sequencer that come up with ways to control all these synthesized parameters, but also generate all these amazing different ways of sequencing the song or the patterns that you have. But yeah, that to me is the goal, because I'm always looking for new interesting drum sounds, and I'm always like finding myself not bored, but I feel like we're living in an exciting time now, and no one's really taken that on. I'm waiting for someone to do that, and if anyone wants to do that, let me know. Let's make that happen, because I would love for there to be like an awesome state-of-the-art modern drum synthesizer, 6 to 8 voices you can totally customize and do crazy stuff with. And yeah, I'm waiting for that. That would be my dream. So
that's awesome. All right, great answer. I think we all want this to happen in the chat.
Totally.
It looks like people are ready to sign up for the Kickstarter. So
the Kickstarter for that, yeah.
Yeah, this will be on YouTube, this archive, so you never know. If you're a designer out there, if you're a company, if you're one of Richard's friends that happen to check this out, like, talk to Richard, make it happen. So
right.
Dylan Deep Belvedere in the chat had a question that you kind of already actually got into just now, about work-life balance, and sort of like, how do you, as someone who, you said you have a sound design day job, but then also like you're freelancing a lot, it seems like you're doing a lot, you working with all these different companies, and then you have your own creative explorations and wanting to have fun with the stuff, and obviously family, and
yeah, it's a lot.
I don't know if there's an answer there, but if there's maybe something you could say to it.
Yeah, it's time management. Yeah, it's really, obviously when you got kids, those are your priority. You have to feed them. They're always screaming that they need stuff or they get hurt. So you can still do things, but you just kind of bend your schedule around them. I don't know if you have kids or not, but for me, it's been a lot of kind of rearranging my life to bend around having kids and bedtime, homework, feeding them, school stuff, and all the things that come with having kids, which is amazing. I love my kids. They're the most amazing thing. They're nonstop comedy machines, both of them. And it's like I said, it's just time management. I've gotten a lot better about it since having kids. Before, I was pretty good. My schedule was sort of completely different before kids. I would work all night. Like I was a night owl kind of a person. And my wife is the exact opposite. She had a regular office desk job where she would have to get up really early. So I would be coming to bed just as she would be getting up to go to work. Now that we have kids, that completely has changed. Now I work really early. I get up early in the morning, whatever it is. My daughter's still in online school, but I think she's going to be going back to real school like in September or August, I think. So when she goes back, we're going to go back to our old schedule where I, drive her to the bus stop in the morning. We're up at 7, we're up earlier. We're up at 6, breakfast and stuff. I drop her off at the bus stop, and then I come back and I start working immediately from 7 o'clock on. And then depending if my wife is around, pick up the kids to 2:30. My son would go to another Montessori school that unfortunately shut down. But yeah, it'd be like 5 or so. I'd have to pick them up, bring them home. We do the whole dinner thing, and then homework, bedtime, and then I might chill with my wife for a little bit, but then she usually falls asleep on the couch, and then I'll come back in the studio and I'll work for another 3-4 hours, and then I go to bed. And that's usually pretty much how the schedules run during the week. And the weekends are a little different. Sometimes we do camping, or we go do things, go hiking, kayaking. We do a lot of outdoor stuff, usually when the weather is better. So that's usually how I do it. In those hours that I do get to work in the studio, I try to pack them in as much as I can, action packed, try to get as much done as I can. And it's good. I feel like I'm more productive because, when you feel like you have less time, you get more done. I feel that way. That's kind of how I see it. I felt like when I had more time, I'd kind of goof around. I'd watch like videos for hours or do things that wouldn't really accomplish much. But when you have like a set 4 or 5 hours, this is all I have. Okay, I've got these goals I have to meet, and you just burn right through them. And that's kind of how it is for me. That's usually how I've been handling stuff lately.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And it's amazing that you're able to, get all this done. So it's good to have some insight.
A lot, yeah.
I can definitely relate to when you have too much free time, that ends up being the least productive time.
At least for me it is.
I can absolutely relate to that. So we're at the 4 o'clock mark. I was worried that we wouldn't be able to keep you entertained or engaged running the talk for 2 hours. And of course, you have much to say, much to share with us. So I have to thank you, Richard, so much for joining us. It really is awesome.
No problem. My pleasure.
And you've been a real supporter of the Atlanta Synthesizer Club community, and helped put us on the map as a city that is a place, a hub for this stuff. And maybe one day we'll have a modular store. You'd think with
that'd be awesome.
The amount of us that are into it, maybe that could happen one day. But it's really great to have you. Like I said, this is going to be up, and if you're watching this later on YouTube or wherever, make sure to follow us on Twitch. It's VLSC Records. VLSC_records on Twitch, and that's the Atlanta Synth Club. I'm a member and organizer, and so I host things on this Twitch platform, which is my crew that does shows and releases music, and just because this is where we already built a Twitch platform. So anyway, that's what we do. If you're watching this later, if you want to be involved in new, I mentioned it to say, if you want to, next time there's a guest, if you want to participate in the chat like these folks, be sure to tune in live. Once again, hey, everybody in the chat, we'll do a little emoji hand, but thanks, Richard, for joining us. And then now we're gonna transition to our VLSC Records streaming content for the day. It's our 4-year anniversary, so we've got all kinds of cool programming, and I'll talk about that more later. But Richard, I'm gonna let you go. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Awesome. Bye.